Okay, so continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today we are proud to present Sherman McRae from FamilyTree DNA. Sherman is an experienced genealogist specializing in African American genetic genealogy and research primarily within the Carolinas, and serves as co-admin on the Ydna Haplogroup project. He has a special interest in the genetic and scientific advancement of Africans and the people of the diaspora in hopes of bridging the genetic divide and discovering new haplogroups that exist in under-tested populations. Sherman has been working for FamilyTree DNA, the group's department, acting as a liaison between the researchers and the company, as well as doing national lectures on how to use DNA testing for genealogy. In addition, he assists the research and development department at FamilyTree DNA with various projects within the company. He was born and raised in Thomasville, North Carolina, and attended North Carolina Central University, where he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in 2006, and is a member of the Omega Psi Pi Fraternity Incorporated. Sherman worked in education prior to joining FamilyTree DNA in March of 2018. In the first part of his 2-week presentation to our lab, he will be discussing all 3 types of DNA and how they can be utilized for genealogy. He will discuss why we should take DNA tests, as well as strengths and limitations of each test. The presentation will also delve into what the actual testing involves, and he will wrap it up by providing everyone with some tools and tips to advance their knowledge and research. So without further ado, I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Sherman.
Thank you for inviting me on today. My name is Sherman McRae. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've been working with FamilyTree DNA for about 3 years now. I'm actually relatively new to genealogy. I started doing genealogy probably about 6 years ago, and I just signed up for a free trial on Ancestry, like many people, and I found my 3rd great grandparents that night, and I've kind of been addicted ever since. And so I ultimately tested my grandmother and some other relatives. The results were processing. I just really read up on autosomal DNA, and so when the results posted, I was just really able to hit the ground running, and I gained a firm grasp of autosomal DNA, centimorgans, and how to do triangulation and things like that. I think that's eventually what led to the job at the company, and I've been doing lectures for the company for the past 2 years. So I'm really appreciative that you guys invited me to be on, and so we'll get started. This presentation today is just really a basic genealogy presentation. I definitely understand and listening to the conversations before we got started that there's definitely different levels of genealogists within this program right here. And so this is probably new for some people, and it may be a refresher for others. And so my program next week will be a bit more in depth. I'll talk a bit more about triangulation, and I'll go into big Y testing. And I think there was another administrator here. She was speaking about the ancient DNA samples. And so I'll speak a bit more about that next week. And so we'll get started. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. And of course, most researchers, when they get started with genealogy, they have questions. Where was my grandmother born? Or, where was our great grandfather? Where did they die? And there's also stories passed down throughout our families about people, being Native American and things of that nature. But this presentation will focus on a number of different things, and essentially why should we take a DNA test? And we'll also discuss what DNA testing can do, what it can't do, and I'll talk about who came up with the idea for genetic genealogy in terms of starting a company, and we'll also talk about what type of tests there are. We'll also talk about what does the DNA testing involve as well. And this is also important. We'll discuss who you should test, because sometimes we have to do targeted testing. It's pretty, with autosomal DNA testing, we pretty much go by the general rule that you want to test as many people as possible to fill in those gaps. And I started back with the oldest people, and then I came forward, started back with my further generations, and I test my mom and then myself, etc. Because everyone will inherit different amounts of DNA. And so it paints a clearer picture once you start to test as many people as possible. You're able to build that genome out a bit more. And we also look at why results can change over time. And we'll also look at some GEDmatch and other third-party tools and how they can be utilized to advance our genealogy, our research. And so that's the main question. We've decided to test, and now what? The number one rule in testing is to always expect the unexpected, especially with autosomal, considering we inherit the DNA from both sides of the family going back 6 or 8 or sometimes further. We may see matches show up that we've never expected. I see a lot of times on Ydna tests, people may have a different surname than they were expecting, and all that's just for various reasons. So definitely when you enter the field of DNA testing, when you get started, I think you should always expect to see some things or uncover some things that you just never fathom in a lot of cases. DNA testing can confirm suspected family relationships. It can rule out unrelated lines, which ultimately saves time and money. It can provide leads that are genetically related. Of course, it could also show ancestral origins and overall ancestral percentage estimates, as well as it can facilitate sharing with people who are interested in your genealogy. DNA testing can't provide you with an instant downloadable pedigree. It really takes some work and a lot of effort and time to really, trace our lines back. So it's nothing instant. DNA testing can't instantly provide specific locations where your ancestors lived. Neither could it automatically qualify you to register for a Native American tribe. It also cannot tell you what Native American tribe you're from. We're able to detect Native American segments, but it's not specific enough to say whether you're Cherokee, et cetera, et cetera. And also, it can't automatically qualify you for Israeli citizenship under the law of return. And so whose idea was DNA testing for genealogy anyway? So in the beginning, our former owner, Bennett Greenspan, who was a retired entrepreneur, he was a genealogist, and then he kind of got back started in the genealogy in the late 90s. And so he discovered two people who he thought should be related, but the paper trail wouldn't prove they were. And so he recalled reading a paper in which Ydna testing was used to compare current Jewish populations to the Kohanim, the priest class said to be descendants of Aaron. And so genetic genealogy was born. Bennett, our former owner, he contacted one of the authors of the paper, Dr. Hammer. I'm sure some people here might have heard of him at the University of Arizona. And he convinced him to do Ydna testing. And so Bennett's suspicions were actually proven, and he realized that other genealogies would benefit from such a test. And so in 2000, him and a partner, Max, they started FamilyTree DNA. And so prior to that time, DNA testing for genealogy was only confined to academia. So this was the first genetic genealogy testing company, FamilyTree DNA. So it was started in 2000 by genealogists for genealogists based in Houston, Texas, of course. It's the only company that offers a full suite of Ydna, mitochondrial, and autosomal DNA testing. So we test all three types of DNA. And of course, other companies, they might just hone in on one specific type of testing. We have our own lab, and we store your sample, and we also store your sample for additional customer orders. And so typically someone may, because you can upgrade tests, someone may order a test, maybe Y37, and they may pick back up later on, a couple years later, and they may want to upgrade that to a big Y or a Y111. And so we will actually pull the vial from storage, and we'll run the test on that. And so this is a good thing because over time, of course, A lot of testers, they pass away, and so quite often their relatives or an administrator, they may reach out to us to see if we could upgrade their sample. And so years ago, when we started filling out our Haplotry a bit more, we went through a whole lot of old testers, and we looked at the people who would that we could sponsor a big Y upgrade for, and just to see what their terminal SNP would be. And so we pulled loads of old samples from early 2000, 2005, and we were able to get results from them. And so we're also the only company with group projects that help advance research. We have no subscriptions with our company. You pay for your testing. You always have access to your account and the research projects. And of course, we don't sell, rent, or barter your personal information. One of the main things that we have to decide once we get into the field of DNA research, etc., is like which test is right for me. And of course, that all depends. You have to find out what your goals are in testing, because you might not be the correct person to test. I know for my maternal grandfather's Ydna, of course, I come from his daughter, so my mother didn't inherit his Y chromosome, so I would have to test the uncle to get a line on my maternal grandfather's Ydna lineage. And so each test does something different. And so we'll just take a brief look at the science. Of course, this is our chromosomes. We have 46 chromosomes, and those are showing 22 pairs of autosomes, and the bottom square shows the one pair of sex chromosomes, an X and a Y. Of course, the Y, men only inherit the Y, and X chromosome, that links you to a female relative. And of course, mutations are definitely important when we're looking at DNA, because those are natural occurrences that happen within our genome. And so it's always a good thing to kind of get a understanding of mutations and how and why they happen. So this is looking at the Emt Dna, and it has 16,569 base pairs. And so the HVR1 and 2 region right there, they're called hypervariable regions. And so we test those regions. So typically a match on the HVR1 region is really, really ancient. It could be 10, 20,000 years ago. And of course, a match on a second region will be a bit closer, but still pretty far back. It could be 500 or 1,000 years. mtDNA mutates real slowly, and so you can have a perfect match on a coding region, and your common ancestor with that person still could be within the last 500 years. And so mtDNA is typically used for like a deep ancestral type of test. It can show you how your maternal ancestors migrated throughout the world, and it can also glean some other information as well. So the coding region is the part of the mtDNA that examines the part of the genes. And so our full sequence mtDNA test examines the coding region. So essentially, there could be more mutations that happen. And so your haplogroup could be H1M3. With a basic mtDNA test. And so that's why you want to get your coding region examined, because they're going to see if they can find other mutations that happen. And so you can get your true defined haplogroup, maternal haplogroup, by taking a full sequence mtDNA test. And so mutations, according to the National Institute of Health, a genetic mutation is a permanent change in a DNA sequence that makes up a gene. By comparing genetic mutations against a database, patterns emerge. For genealogy, we look at two types of mutations. We look at short tandem repeats, they're called STRs, and SNP, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And I'll speak a bit more about that in just a second. So why mtDNA? Both men and women can take mtDNA tests, and it traces the direct maternal line. You think mother. So the only matches that you'll pick up on the mtDNA test, you only share a maternal grandmother at some point in time, whether it's 100 years ago or 10,000 years ago. You're going to share a common grandmother with that person. mtDNA test provides a list of matches who share direct common maternal ancestry within the last 52 generations. We look at a generation at 25 years, and so it goes really far back once you do the calculations. It also provides ancestral migration routes stretching back thousands of years, and that's revealed by your haplogroup. And so this is just a screenshot of some mtDNA matches. And you could look here on the left, you see someone with a genetic distance. That means that they're a perfect match, but their common grandmother could still be as far back as 400 or 500 years. And so when you're looking at the genetic distance on the side, you see 1, 2. And so those are the number of markers that they don't match. So genetic distance is essentially looked at as a mismatch. So the greater the genetic distance, in most cases, typically the further back the common ancestor would be. And so this screenshot shows that this person has 89 matches, and they have one good match at a genetic distance of 1. And you could also see the common maternal ancestor if you look in the middle of the screen. But they are all, and also to the right of that, you can look at their haplogroup. Since everyone took a full sequence mitochondrial test, the haplogroup is really defined, H4A1A4B. And so that's a really defined haplogroup right there. And so the haplogroup provides information as to the origins or the area of the world, and of course the migration route they could have took as well. mtDNA does not give you an ethnic percentage. They don't examine enough DNA. Only autosomal tests can provide you with an ethnic breakdown. You can't get a percentage because you're only looking at one line of your ancestors. So just to repeat, you can only get an ethnic prediction from looking at autosomal DNA testing. And it does, however, provide you with a haplogroup. And so this is a haplogroup right here, screenshot of mine. And my Y haplogroup is EM2. My maternal haplogroup is L2C. And so I've tested other family members. I got them tested with big Ys before I did myself. So I'm actually finally upgrading my test to a big Y. And so I'll get a better inclination of what my terminal SNP would be. But through my own research, I know that my Ydna haplogroup was probably born around Central Africa, maybe around the Congo. I have loads of African matches, distant African matches from that area. And my maternal haplogroup is L2C. And you can glean information from your haplogroup assignments as well. Like L2C, we know it's maybe like 20,000 years old. It's a really old haplogroup as well. I hadn't had many mutations. I had a full sequence test done. I thought that I would have a more defined haplogroup, but still came back as L2C. And so I do know that it's found more commonly in the Senegambia region of West Africa, and also among the Mende and Dna people from Sierra Leone. And so a haplogroup is a group of genetically similar people, and they're assigned labels that represent their place on the Ydna or mtDNA organizational tree. We call it a haplotry or tree of humanity. And so when someone's test, especially have a SNP test done, we'll put their information on a haplotry, and you can see how you match up with other testers. Haplogroups correspond with migratory paths. It essentially shows you the migration route path that your ancestors would have took, leaving Africa and going into their various parts of the world. And so a haplotry is a hierarchical way of organizing branches. So now we're looking at this is a screenshot of a Ydna haplotry. This is actually from my first cousin 3 times removed. I was trying to get a line on my second great grandfather's Ydna line. And so this person, he's my great grandmother's first cousin, although he would be 20 years. He's like in his 80s, although if she was living, she would be probably, much older than him. And so I was thoroughly surprised when I took this Ydna test that in doing my research, it looked like my third great grandfather could have been the offspring of an enslaver, possibly. I thought he was European because of all the matches that we were gathering around with my family. But this actually proved that my third great grandfather's father was actually an African, because otherwise we'd have a European haplogroup. So having this Ydna testing really solved the puzzle for me, because I was linking my family I was linking my tree to the European family the wrong way. And so this actually confirmed that I was headed down the wrong path, so to speak. And so what we're looking at here is the branches downstream. So this is actually one of the oldest Ydna lineages in the world. We come from the root of the phylogenetic tree. So you would look at it, a Y chromosome Adam. He had 2 kids. One of them would be A00, and I'm at the AV148. So I come from the other son of the Y chromosome Adam. And so those are the downstream SNPs that we'll see that if we test positive or negative for once his big Y test comes back. And so this is one thing that I love so much about Ydna. It just gives you so much information and insight into your lineage. And this is an Emt Dna Haplotry. As I was mentioning earlier, this the haplogroup, or it just shows the migration path that your ancestors took. And so we probably all have some similar haplogroups, and there'll be some differences as well. And so we kind of look at this tree right here to kind of get an inclination of how the migratory path that our ancestors took over the course of time. And I'll also talk briefly about Ydna. Of course, Ydna, only men could take a Ydna. It traces the direct paternal line. You think your father's line. It provides a list of matches who share a common direct paternal ancestry. And it also provides an ancestral migration route, or a haplogroup of your direct paternal line. So there are 2 types of Ydna tests. You have STR testing, and that would include the regular tests like Y12, 37, 67, Y111. And you have, so those tests count 37, 67, or 111 markers. The Y12 test, we do still sell, but we took it offline because it's really, you can still purchase it if you want. But with so much genetic information being found with this new test, we now know that the Y12 test is like almost irrelevant. We encourage people to start at least 37 markers to get rid of the convergence, the marker convergence. Sometimes due to marker convergence, because as we talked briefly earlier, mutations have to occur. There are natural occurrences that have to happen. So those DYS markers, DYS 19, 20, etc., they have to change numbers over the course of time. And so that's why you want to test as many markers as possible to get rid of the convergence. So what happens with convergence is that because those numbers have to mutate, you may have people showing up more closely related to you than they actually are. And so that's why as many markers as possible. And so Ydna tests, STR tests, are used for matching individuals. And we'll talk about SNPs. SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphism. Essentially, I look at SNPs as unique points of DNA that are inherited from a common ancestor. And so we may test positive for some, and we may test negative for some. But throughout that information, this is how science has ultimately started to advance, and we're able to use SNP testing to ultimately figure out our common ancestor with other matches, like how far back our connection would be. And SNPs, they also name subclades, and they are geographically and chronologically significant. So what we're looking at here are Ydna STR values. As I was mentioning earlier, when I started talking about mutations and the convergence, you see DYS 393, 390, DYS 14, etc. So when you take, these are STRs, or short tandem repeats. So when you take a regular Ydna test, you come back with markers that look like this. And so if you look over to the far right at the top, you see some asterisks there. I think those are the markers that mutate faster than others. So scientists have recognized that some of the markers have a higher propensity to mutate than others. And so this would make a match appear more distantly related than they are because of the markers, the certain number of markers that have the propensity to mutate a bit erratically. So those numbers will start to change a bit more frequently than expected. This is how your we're going to come out with a new layout in the next couple of weeks, so we're going to release it to the public. And so this is like our new Ydna matches page. And so this is from one of my tests. And so this shows my uncle and his matches. And so if you look at the first match, I hope you guys can see that. It shows that markers tested. It shows that we had 111 markers. And if you look at the second one, say the genetic step 1, so that means that we have a genetic distance of 1. So that means we match on 110 out of 111 markers tested. And it shows our haplogroup EM96 right here. And so like the second match is going to be a bit more genetically distant for our common to reach our common ancestor. We have a genetic distance of 6. And so that means that we match on 105 out of 111 markers examined. And so we know that our common ancestor is going to be a bit further back than my first match. I actually found him, the first match, as an autosomal match on Ancestry. And we knew, we had an idea of how we're related. And so he had his Ydna tested with FamilyTree DNA, and I tested family members, and they matched up. And so now we know that our common ancestor was a gentleman named Alex Smith that lived in Anson County, North Carolina, and was born around the year 1800. And so that was a really great find, finding him as an autosomal match, and we both linking up to do Ydna test, and they come back as a match. And so essentially, this is how the Ydna page looks. It shows the number of markers tested and the genetic distance. If you look in the second column, it says genetic distance, and it shows the steps. So someone matching me at a genetic distance of 6, our common ancestor could be pretty far back, a few hundred years ago for sure. And Ydna, of course, does not give you ethnic percentages. You can't get a percentages because you're only looking at one line of your ancestor. This is the same thing I was speaking about when we briefly were talking about autosomal testing. Ydna, it does, however, give you a basic haplogroup to start, and for a more specific haplogroup, additional testing is required. And so when you, Ydna testing just gives you regular YSTR testing that looks at your markers, just provides you with a predicted haplogroup. And you have to get into more advanced testing like SNP testing, like with the big Y, and you'll reach your terminal SNP. Your terminal SNP is your most defined placement on the haplotry. So I look at it like, the most common European haplogroup is RM269. I forget how old that haplogroup is, but having your markers tested, it'll refine your haplogroup a bit more and further downstream. And when we say further downstream, it essentially means closer in time. And so we could find a SNP that's a couple hundred years old or something along those lines. And so that's why I always encourage testers to upgrade their test to the big Y, because it's like you get more information back through SNP testing, and they also look at your STRs as well. And of course, this is a Ydna migration map, and this shows how our paternal ancestors left Africa and went into their respective parts of the world. Of course, the example I showed you earlier was haplogroup A, and so you can see Y chromosome atom being found there, and it shows how they migrated. And of course, you could probably, if you've done any type of testing, you could probably look and see your haplogroup as well. Just kind of follow that route that they've took in and around and leaving Africa. And so autosomal DNA, of course, is the random recombination of DNA that we inherit from both ancestors. So both men and women can take autosomal DNA test. Autosomal DNA traces the ancestral lines to provide a percentage breakdown of the regions of the world in which your ancestors came from. So you get an ethnic breakdown in percentages. It can show you if you're Native American, have some Jewish segments, etc. This is the basic test that most people start off with, but it gives you loads of information. Autosomal DNA provides a list of matches who share common ancestors from any of your ancestral lines within the past 5 generations. And typically you can find matches where your common ancestor is more than 5 generations. I'll put it up to maybe even 6 or 7 generations at time. And we count a generation as 25 years. And so autosomal DNA is a random recombination of DNA, and and it combines the inherited DNA together. And so this is how your Family Finder matches pages will look. So the first person listed, of course, will be my mother. And so I want people to look at the shared DNA column. And this is where you see the CM. CM means centimorgan, or it's like a unit of measurement. It shows how much DNA you share with the person. And based off the amount of DNA you share with somebody, that's how we predict your relationship. So I share about 3,300 centimorgans with my mom, about 3,200 centimorgans with my father, and the third person will be my grandmother. And you can look at the relationship range, and it also shows how much DNA we share. And our longest block is the longest uninterrupted block of DNA. Since autosomal DNA is broken down and recombined, we still, chunks of DNA that are unbroken are still passed down. And so looking at your longest block actually gives you a greater confirmation that your connection with these with the matches are even more relevant. Of course, autosomal DNA does not provide you with a haplogroup. Your autosomal DNA is made of recombined bits of your parents' DNA. So it also doesn't give you one single migratory path. You just get matches back from your relatives on all sides of the family. I think we have roughly 16 second great grandparents, 32 third, and you just keep doubling with every generation. And you might inherit a block of DNA from your third great grandfather, and you may not inherit any from your third great grandmother. It's really random how we just inherit those segments of DNA, but we use those segments in a triangulation to figure out still how we relate it to those matches. Autosomal DNA does, however, give you overall percentages of your ethnic origins. And so I believe that ethnicity is an estimate, and it can give you good clues as well. It can provide you some good information, but at the same time, it's like really not an end-all be-all, because science is still advancing and it's changing. So a company can make an update to their autosomal database, or they can make some ethnicity updates, and you may have more DNA from one group that you had than you had before the update, or vice versa. I hear a lot of I often see people upset that they might have had some certain DNA segments that were lowered or taken away with an update, and so that definitely happens. And so ethnicity estimates, they use reference populations representative of world populations. And so the company or the algorithm would typically match you to the closest reference population. And of course, it can be beyond 5 to 6 generations. And we also remember that nationality is not really your ethnicity. And so why do ethnicity estimates change? Of course, companies, they update their reference populations. I mean, the goal is to get more refined and more accurate. And so companies will typically add more reference populations from these specific areas of people within our database in hopes to refine their ethnicity estimates a bit more. Of course, ethnicity estimates change with the addition of new populations. They may also refine existing populations. And of course, the updates and algorithms, all of these things play a huge impact as to why your ethnicity estimate changes over time. And of course, companies may just update or overhaul their entire autosomal program. And so with that, they may change reference populations. Of course, they may change their algorithm as well, or change the name of the various features, and changes in the chip as well. Those can all impact your ethnicity estimates. If a company was using older chip, or a chip that had less information, and then they switch it up, all those things can impact why your ethnicity estimates may change. And so this is just a screenshot of my origins. And this shows one individual. It shows their ethnic makeup. As you can see there, they're pretty mixed. And the New World, they show about 6% Native American. It points out their Middle Eastern segments, their African segments. And so this is how an ethnicity estimate looks once you, if you test with FamilyTree DNA. You'll be able to see all the segments of DNA that you've inherited from your ancestors from all sides of your family. And this is just another screenshot of, let me go back, of another gentleman. I think this is an older version where we didn't have all the reference populations as we do now. So we came out with an update called My Origins 3, and we added loads of new reference samples. And so that's why this is their old screenshot, and the first screenshot was their newer breakdown with the My Origins. So we'll talk briefly about what all DNA testing involves. So of course you want to choose and order your test. Of course, you definitely want to know, get some information as to what you're doing. Quite often people will purchase a test because it's expensive, and they realize that it wasn't what they're looking for after results are posted. So you really want to have a thorough understanding of what type of test you're doing and the information that it's going to reveal. Quite often I see people purchasing an Emt Dna test when they really want an autosomal test. And so that happens quite often. But our company, we use cheek swabs. And so you essentially swab your cheek for a minute or two, put it in a solution, and send it back. And we'll process it and let you know. So the sample is also extracted, analyzed, and matched against our database. And of course, we'll notify you by email when your results are ready. And once the results are ready, you can really sign in and get started. You can look at your matches. We have tools there, chromosome browsers, and other things, as well as you could join a research project and see how the administrators align you up against other people in the database. So if you test it with other companies, FamilyTree DNA transfers, MyHeritage, I think they might charge a fee. I'm not sure, but they did accept transfers at some point in time, or they may have specials a couple of times a year. If you test it with Geno, we will offer you a discount to test with the Family Finder for $39. And so Ancestry and 23andMe, of course, they do not accept transfers, and so you cannot transfer into their database like you can with MyHeritage or FamilyTree DNA. If you test it with them, of course, you can download your raw data and you can transfer it over to our site, and so we'll upload it and we'll match you with people that are in our database. And so we have tools there that you can pay $19 to unlock. So if you want to use our chromosome browser, our My Origins, look at your ethnicity estimate, then you would just pay a one-time $19 fee. But we'll provide you your matches for free if you don't want to unlock the purchase to unlock for $19. So we try to provide some incentive for autosomal testers to come into our database, considering they could upload their test there for free and look at the matches who've tested with FamilyTree DNA. And so, of course, questions are, how can I get the most out of my results? And of course, you definitely just want to keep an open mind, because we just never know what just shows up within our test. Of course, we can find siblings, cousins who were adopted that are reaching out. cousins that are adopted that might reach out, and you may be the key to breaking down their brick wall, because it could be your aunt or uncle that could be their parent. And so we just always want to keep an open mind. And I also recommend to have a family tree available to share. Typically, when I reach out to a match, I give them my lineage, I tell them my surnames, etc., and I give them access, or I'll send them a screenshot of my family tree, or I post one up so they can take a look at it themselves, because that also helps them out to be able to look at your tree, dates, names, locations. They may be able to gain clues from that in order to figure out how you are connected. And of course, you want to contact your matches. That's something I do quite often. I typically, as I was just stating, I reach out to my matches and I just give them as much information about me as possible, in hopes that they'll respond to me and we can start a correspondence to figure out our connection. And of course, you want to consider testing known family members. The more family members you test, the further out you're going to be able to go. And so that's why I spoke earlier about testing your oldest people first and coming forward. Sometimes you may need to go outwards and test cousins, distant cousins, etc., because everyone will pick up different amounts of DNA coming from your common ancestors. And so you also pick up more matches that way as well, that also intertwine with those lines. And so we always recommend the testing known family members, because it helps you out and it makes you understand your matches more. Because I might share a certain amount of DNA with a cousin, but because I tested my grandmother and her great aunt, now I'm able to really see how we were connected, because they share more DNA than we do. And of course, you want to, I'm sorry, that was out the way, but you want to establish a group project. I'm sorry, that went out the way. One moment, sorry about that. And so you also want to keep in mind, you want to expect the unexpected, and you don't expect to have matches you immediately recognize for various reasons, because people were adopted, women get married, people change names. But one thing that tie you all back together is the fact that you share this amount of DNA. And so that's what I like to focus on. And I don't get caught up when I'm looking at a test and I just don't see a lot of names that I recognize, because I understand now as a genealogist that there's reasons for that. And we also want to understand that DNA testing is a tool, but that tool is not a magic wand. It really takes some effort and lots of work and hours to really trace our lineage back, especially through DNA. Quite often I see people that take a test and, they may call us and they might not have just fully understand the effort that it takes sometimes. It's not like it's a puzzle. I look at it that way, but it's just so many so many pieces that are intertwined to piece that puzzle back together, that it really involves a lot of work and effort, not only by you, but with your matches and your other relatives as well. And of course, DNA can be more like a compass than a GPS. I always recommend, of course, having a family tree to share. And so we go by this rule that you treat your matches the way you would want to be treated. So we recommend having at least a basic tree to share, whether on the site or by email. And we try to recommend that you build a tree out 4 to 5 generations as much as possible, and also extend it out and include your siblings and your aunts, uncles, etc., because they may also provide clues to your matches who want to look at this information. And you also want to contact your matches. We recommend starting with the closest matches first, the ones sharing your ancestral surnames. And we've discussed having a family tree, how important that is. And so you can identify the matches in a testing company, since many people match multiple kits and they might test at multiple companies. So when you're contacting them, whether you're looking at GEDmatch, for example, people that tested Ancestry to 23andMe may all upload to a third-party site such as GEDmatch. And so if you're getting a match from there, when you're reaching out, you just want to let them know, hey, I saw you as a match on GEDmatch. We share this amount of DNA, and just provide them with as much information as possible. And so we consider testing family members because the more known relationships you have, the easier it is to triangulate. And it just makes it so much easier by testing as many people as possible. It really saves you a lot of time, effort, and heartache in a lot of cases. So siblings, cousins, etc. may all have matches you don't, because we are all inheriting different amounts of DNA from our ancestors. I think roughly 50% of fourth cousins don't share any type of DNA. And so you may test a cousin, you may not match that person, but your cousin may share DNA with that person. They could have inherited some segments of DNA. So that's why you just want to make your, just expand out as much as possible. And so you're also contributing to the database as well as to the knowledge pool by testing as many family members as possible. And of course, as I spoke earlier, your relative may break down someone else's brick wall. And that's very possible. I think recently, every day I wake up and I look at my family to see what new matches came in. So recently, I saw a match that looked like a second cousin to my grandmother, and I could look at the matches in common, and I could tell how we were related, like on my Sturtevant side. And so I have access to about 100 kids on Ancestry. So I looked at my oldest Sturtevant ancestors, and I looked at one of the brothers, and I saw this young lady. She matched up as a niece. And I looked at the second kid, and she matched up as a niece. And I looked at the third brother, and it said that this lady was his daughter. He's 83, and she was 56. So he had no idea that he had a daughter that old. And so it's just things like that that you're just able to find and easily figure out by testing as many people as possible. And so who should you test? Of course, that just depends. Like, what are your goals in testing? What are you looking to find? You definitely just need to have some clearly defined goals and know exactly what information you're going to gain from taking an autosomal DNA test, mtDNA, etc. So just figure out what your goals are. If you're trying to look for your second great grandparent, third great grandparent, etc., you just want to have some thoroughly defined goals and a thorough understanding, of course, of what type of test you're going to take and the information that it provides. And of course, who are you trying to find? Those are other important things to consider, because if you're searching for a male relative, you may want to reach out and have do Ydna testing, etc., on a direct male descendant. And of course, what questions are you trying to answer as well? Those are something else important. And just like I spoke earlier about doing a Ydna test on a different relative to confirm whether or not my third great grandfather was the mulatto offspring of an enslaver, well, doing a Ydna test confirmed that he wasn't the offspring of the plantation owner. And so we have roughly about 6,500 group projects here, or research projects, and they're a great tool to advance your research. Some of them are ran by some of the best researchers in the world. And so you take a test and you join that project, and they'll typically group you along with other people in a project that have a similar genetic signature. And so that helps out immensely. And so the fact that you're able to reach out to like some of the greatest researchers, like these people, they specifically work on this stuff day in and day out. So it's a great resource because they can ultimately maybe be able to tell you stuff about your family or where they come from just through the research that they've done before you even join the project. And so group projects, you share information and results with those who all have a common goal. And of course, that's just to figure out where your commonalities are, where your lines intersect. And so the group projects are great for that, as well as the researchers who run those projects. And they are volunteers, so they take their time. I mean, quite often some of the volunteers, they spend their own money recruiting matches because they know that by upgrading this test of this respective person, that they may fill in a gap or break down a brick wall. And so you also pool your resources, such as funds for testing. Quite often genealogists or other people in the research project, if they may all pitch in to upgrade your test to a big Y700, since that test is relatively expensive. So everybody kind of pitches in and for the common goal, just to see what the results would be, and hopefully in hopes of breaking down a brick wall or finding new information. And you also draw on the experience of others. Another question would be like, who should I test? And of course, we say everybody. Just test as many people as possible and widen your net as far as you can, because it just makes your job a whole lot easier when you're able to look at multiple tests. So this was the end of the first part of my presentation. Next week, I'll come back and I'll be a bit more in depth with Ydna. I'll speak about ancient DNA samples and also give some examples of autosomal triangulation. But today, I just want to give a brief introduction of the DNA test and the type of things that we can do. And of course, I'm open for questions. And I really appreciate you guys inviting me on. And of course, I'm looking forward to coming back next week. So if anybody have any questions, I'm definitely available.
I have one.
Sure.
There were 3 types of DNA tests you mentioned: MTA, autosomal, and Ydna. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Autosomal, Emt Dna, and Ydna.
Okay, cool.
And we have, with Ydna, we also have a more advanced test as well. I'll speak about that one next week. Called the Big Y test.
Yeah, you call it the Big Y 700?
Numbers. Yes, ma'am. And that's like a really high sequence DNA test that looks about 70% of the Y chromosome. Looks at all the mutations. We call them variants. And so we pick up the variants that you share with other testers, regardless if y'all are related 5,000 years ago or 200 years ago. And so we also provide you with your terminal SNP. And so what happens is we have within our genome, we're going to have some mutations that only we have so far. And so what happens is you take the Big Y test and you're just sitting there, and when somebody else comes along and tests positive for that SNP, then you guys will create a new branch on the Haplotry, and that's how it keeps extending itself further and further downstream or closer in time.
Can you give me a ballpark pricing for those 3 different types of tests?
Yes. So Y37, I'm just guessing, would be like 169 or something to that effect. Maybe okay. 120. Big Y full price is like typically $449, but we have sales quite often throughout the year where the price is reduced. We may take $50 off, $70 off of the test. So what happens is that's the benefit of us storing DNA, because someone may take an entry-level test at Y37 and they may wait to the next sale to upgrade to a Y111. The Y111 test, I don't know, it could be around roughly $199, and so that examines 111 of your markers. And so the Big Y test also includes the Y111, but it's also a high sequence SNP test as well, and it refines your haplogroup to something further downstream. And so it's really a high sequence test, and so that's why they're typically a bit more expensive than regular YSTR testing, and they're more accurate as well.
The Big Y checks for what, 700 SNPs?
No, it looks at 700 of your STRs, your short tandem repeats. So our regular Y-DNA test looks at, up to 111 STRs. You can start off with the 37 marker test, and you can upgrade to a Y111. So the Big Y test not only looks at 111 markers, it also tests another 700 STRs. In addition to your SNPs, those unique points of DNA inherited. So people from, especially like Europe, because R1b, RM269, those are like European, like I think haplogroup RM269, and the Scandinavian haplogroup M223, like those are some of the most defined. They've done so much testing with Big Y that their haplotry in that place is just so defined because they continually are doing so much testing.
Okay.
And so that's what that. So let's say if your family comes from these different clans back in the old world, and those clans, they often change certain names and things of that nature. So you can do a Big Y test, and you can start to see on a block tree how those branches, when those branches started to split up. You'll be able to see that your common ancestor with this person would be 700 years ago, and that man had a certain number of kids, and that line branched off, and they have their own SNPs that are mutating. But because you still share a certain number of SNPs, we're able to pinpoint, make a prediction of how far back your common ancestor would be.
Now, by
So
contrast, the cost to the mtDNA and the autosomal, those run $100 to $150, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Autosomal is the cheapest test. That's like $79. mtDNA, we just recommend you take the full sequence mtDNA test, and that's roughly $100 and some odd as well. Ydna testing, like the big Y, is just so much thorough in the information that it's looking at and the testing. It's a really new type of testing, next generation sequencing. And so it's really just a more powerful test that looks at far more information than mtDNA would, for example. And with the mtDNA, it's just it doesn't really. It's not mtDNA is the best test for genealogy because it mutates so slow, and women change surnames every generation, so it's not the best for tracing back your family. Yeah, and so we take it for, just to add our contribution to science, and maybe just to see what type of information we get back, what type of haplogroup we have, and maybe sometimes we do luck up and find matches that have taken an mtDNA test that also may show up on the family finder. So that's your guarantee that your connection with that person, because they're still showing up on your autosomal test, your connection is definitely probably within the last 150 years if they're showing up in your autosomal results as well.
Okay. And then you said in one comment, you said a cousin could share only 50%, a first cousin?
Oh, no, ma'am. Fourth cousins. 50% of fourth cousins won't share any DNA. Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, cool. You were talking pretty fast, so I was trying to get all my notes. No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, more questions?
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead, Betty.
Yeah. How do you get the DNA from 700 years ago?
Well, you inherit those the SNPs. Essentially, it's those unique points of DNA that are passed down from our common ancestors, and so that's how they know. We're still inheriting that Y chromosome and that mtDNA from our distant ancestors, because it doesn't change that much. So like my like my second great grandfather, he would test positive on the A branch. Like that branch goes back over 200 some thousand years. They come from some of the first archaic humans that ever walked the earth. But the fact that we still share those because we share those STRs and the SNPs, etc., that's how we're able to we still share remnants of DNA from our ancestors. And it's like the short of it. We still share DNA with them, like Ydna.
But you're not able to name them. You just know that it goes back along a certain line.
Yeah, that's where the genealogy and the paper trail, you have to put both of those together and figure out essentially where your common ancestor would be. But that's where the paperwork and genealogy trail, you want to merge all that together to form a good consensus.
Okay, thank you.
And then Sherman, April in the chat box asked, are there any plans to upgrade to the MT test like they do for the Y currently?
The full sequence test it looks at the coding region, so I don't really see them. It could be in the next few years, but that's like the most advanced mtDNA test out on the market. Is the full sequence mtDNA test. The other test, I don't even know of any other companies that do mtDNA testing. I mean, like 23andMe might provide you with a base mtDNA haplogroup, but it's not like it might not be your real haplogroup. So, for example, you could test with, let's say 23andMe, for example, and they provide you with a haplogroup. For example, it could be, H1B or something to that effect. But that might not be your full haplogroup. That's because they don't have the technology to scan your whole mitochondria. And so they may test with a company like FamilyTree DNA, where we're able to scan their whole mitochondria and we pick up more mutations. And so that haplogroup may change from H1B to H1B13C or something along those lines, because we found extra mutations that happen along the mitochondria. So that's the most advanced test available right now. Hadn't heard much about them upgrading that at this point in time.
Okay, and yeah, I have to excuse myself because my internet cut out for just a few moments. So I'm going to ask a question that I hope if you answered while my internet was down, because it took me a few moments to reconnect. Okay. Because we do have some beginners in the class. Could you explain what GEDmatch is?
Oh, yeah. I should have went actually more in depth, and I should have added more slides. So GEDmatch is a third-party tool. So if you've done an autosomal DNA test with 23andMe, Ancestry, FamilyTree DNA, you could upload your results there, and they're gonna you can see how you match with people that might have tested at other companies. So it's like a third-party site where most people that have taken autosomal tests can go to do some comparisons. And so one of the good things about that is, of course, is that you can look at your matches who tested at other companies, but they have some really great tools there that you can utilize to help you out in advancing your research. They have like Chromosome browser, of course, where you can look at the ethnicity of a segment. So I know that, and so I was working with one of my European DNA matches, and he had a little bit of African in him, and of course I have some little bit of European. And so what we realized is that we were related through his white ancestor, and he had gained his African ancestry through another way. Because I was able to look at his ethnicity on a chromosome, I can look and see at this location on the 6th chromosome that this segment was African, etc. And so they have lots of little tools there to help you figure some things out, which are with genealogy related stuff. You may be able to, they have like a Lazarus tool where you can try to recreate the DNA segments of, a dead ancestor, so to speak. So they have a lot of different tools there on that site. It could be a bit overwhelming when you first go there, because it just looks like you see a lot of numbers and stuff. But I often encourage people to just stick with it, watch some tutorials on GEDmatch, because it's a great tool for an advance in genealogy. And I should have included some other sites that I use as well. So if anybody, there's another site called DNA Painter, and so that's another great site as well. And they actually have a relationship chart there, so you can look at a match, and it may say that you share 200 centimorgans, and you plug the 200 centimorgans into the chart, and they're going to give you a relationship estimate. It's going to refine that down for you and show you that there's a 40% chance that this person is a second cousin, et cetera, et cetera. So that helps me out in the fact that I can save time and know where I should be looking for our common ancestor, because I know that, there's a certain chance that this person is a second cousin. Then I know second cousins share great grandparents, et cetera. So then I should be looking for information around my great grandparents. And so there's some third-party sites that in hindsight, I definitely should include. I'll include them next week, more about GEDmatch, some GEDmatch examples, and some other, and I'll show how to do with my triangulation portion of the presentation. So thank you for bringing that up. I actually include some more stuff like that next week.
Okay, and then I have another question. When you were talking about ethnicity percentages, you talked about a chip. Now, we often hear that word chip, as to explain, why ethnicities vary from company to company. But can you explain to the class, what is a chip?
A chip is essentially, it's like, it looks almost like a computer chip, but it's pre-programmed with information. So they may have ethnicity estimates and everything just uploaded on a chip. So I think, and so all that information is just uploaded there, and so they use that chip to match you up with like relatives. They predict your ethnicity. It's like pre-populated information essentially. And so if a company switches to a different chip, then they may have to rework their whole program. So that chip essentially just stores a whole lot of information that DNA testing companies use for matching and things along those lines. So So like 23andMe, for example, they might switch a chip up. So there were some issues and they might switch a chip up and take where they have less information stored on a chip. And sometimes they could have more. And so it could be really interesting how that affects your results. But that's typically what companies use to store like DNA data on for like matching algorithms and things along those lines. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. One of the most common questions I get in the class is, especially for people who are new to doing genealogy and DNA testing, when they consider doing an autosomal test, and I know you went over about, what question do you want answered before you decide which test you want to take. Mm-hmm. But one of the most common questions I get is, if I take a DNA test and I get my autosomal test results back, do I really need to spend money to get my brother or my sister tested, or would my money be better spent trying to get a cousin tested?
Oh yeah, I would actually test my siblings as well. I would test everybody. I encourage all my brothers, siblings, cousins, and everyone else to test, only because of that random recombination, how that works, because we share 50% of DNA with our siblings, or is it 25? So we only share a certain amount of DNA with our siblings. And so therefore they're going to have some matches that we don't match because of the autosomal random recombination. And so you may have a match that looks like a fourth cousin to you, but on your siblings test they share more DNA, and you actually find out that they're a third cousin or a second cousin 3 times removed. So you're getting more information by expanding your sphere of influence, essentially testing more people, because you just never know what matches they may pick up. And so it just paints a clearer picture once you test your siblings, family, cousins, etc. It's like a big puzzle. I look at it like a big puzzle, and so I just try to get everyone to add their addition to the puzzle in hopes of being able to figure more things out. So yes, I would encourage siblings to test as well as cousins.
Yeah, siblings share 50% of DNA usually.
Yeah.
And half siblings 25%.
There you go.
Now, if you're twins, you share 100%. But
yep, that's correct. And so we have other relationships that also show up, and you're able to detect. It takes some work though, like 3/4 siblings, where a man is with 2 sisters, for example, and their kids are called 3/4 siblings. And so it's weird seeing the amount of DNA that they share, but that does happen quite often. Those are some of the things that you see on DNA tests and with your matches. Well, those are some of the things that you reveal, like 3/4 siblings and things of that nature.
One of the things I really like about FamilyTree DNA testing kits is that it has the swab rather than the spit, because a lot of the people I have tested over the years, are my elderly relatives, and doing the spit, seems to be very difficult for them, but the swab is much easier. So from that point, view, I think the FamilyTree DNA autosomal kit is much more friendlier.
Yeah, I think the academic samples, I think that's what they do in academia still, like cheek swabs and things of that nature. And so, yeah, that seems to be a bit more reliable. And of course, older people, because we're looking for the cheek cells. And so, we're able to get better, more sustainable DNA by them swabbing their cheeks as opposed to just saliva type test. So from my understanding, cheek swabs tend to be more reliable than saliva type test. And I also forgot to mention that I actually could I have a couple family finder kits that I can give you if you want to raffle them off as well.
Oh sure, yeah, that'd be great.
So I forgot to mention that as well. So yeah, I have about 2 kits that I can give you to raffle off, or however you want to do it. You just send me the information, whoever wins, and I'll get the account set up as well.
Okay, well then I'll tell you what, I'm going to tell the class right now, if you're still logged in, do not put it in the chat box. Send me an email to my regular email address, smalek@tmcc.edu, And I will put all the names into the hat, have a third party draw it, and we will give out 2 free autosomal tests. Thank you to Sherman's generosity. I really appreciate that, Sherman.
Oh, no problem. Also, I can create some discount codes as well. If there's anyone interested in purchasing a test, you can contact me and I'll give you a discount as well. Okay,
great. And then I also want to remind the class earlier in the class, I had said that I still have 2 giveaways from last week's speaker from Ancestral Logs. And some people put it into the chat box that they want to be entered into it. And what I really need you to do is send me an email rather than put it into the chat box. So just once again, my email is smalek, that's S like sugar, Malek spelled M like mother, ALEK @tmcc.edu, and tell me which raffle you want to enter, whether you want to enter the raffle for last week's guest speaker or for this week's guest speaker, or if you want to do both, that's fine too. Just state both in the email. And once again, everybody who emails me, I will go ahead and put you into a hat. And we got some good giveaways. So thank you very much, Sherman.
No problem. I'll give a couple away next week, at least one next week as well.
Oh, wonderful. And then I do have one other question. While the class, we still got quite a few people logged in here. I was a little confused about genetic distance. Do you mind maybe hitting on that a little bit more?
Yes. So genetic distance is the number of markers that you don't match on. So let's say we are testing 111 markers, and you match on, you have a genetic distance of 1. So that means you match that person on 110 out of 111 markers examined. And so we're able to gain, so someone matching you at a genetic distance of 1 out of 111 markers examined, your common ancestors probably within the last 150 years. So we have an estimate of, it's a rough estimate for the genetic distance that we have, and we kind of use that to calculate. So it's essentially the number of markers that you don't match. So you look at the total number of markers that was tested, and the number of markers that you and a person don't share is called a genetic distance. Genetic distance typically means that your common ancestor is a bit further back than someone with a genetic distance of 1. But that also gets tricky because, as I was speaking, some of those markers mutate faster than others. So you may have, if you have some markers that are mutating fast, then that's going to create a genetic distance. And so that's going to make, you can make a third cousin look like a sixth cousin, so to speak, because of the differences. And that's only because of those natural occurrences, those markers mutating over the course of, well, they're mutating erratically faster than they should be. And so that's where you having like a big wide test, a thorough SNP test done, because, and I'll speak about this more about SNPs. SNPs mutate on average every 80 to 120 years. So they're more reliable than STRs, because the STRs, as I mentioned, has the propensity to mutate a bit more erratic. So SNPs are more stable, and we know that they mutate every 80 to 120 years. So like I'll show next week, like if you take a big wide test and you and someone else, y'all have and within your block you have 3 private variants between you. So since we know that SNPs mutate every 80 to 120 years, we know that your common ancestor, if they both took a big Y700, you would just do 80 times 3, because there's 3 private variants. So we know that your common ancestor was in the last 200 some odd years. And so it's a bit more accurate. SNPs are a bit more accurate than STRs, but that's what the genetic distance is, the number of markers that you don't match with the person, that y'all don't share.
Because I had an interesting experience with my MT test. I matched perfectly with my mother's cousin, because my mother's mother and her mother's mother were sisters. So yes. I matched perfectly. We have a common female grandmother. My grandmother, my great grandmother, her grandmother. But interestingly, I had no other matches. That was it. Just my cousin, who's my second cousin. And however, because I administer her kit on FamilyTree DNA, however, she has many, many matches on her MT, whereas I only have 1 match on my MT, and that's her. So I would assume that the explanation would be a mutation between my mother and me.
there was a mutation that kind of knocked you out of the playing field, so to speak. That's why they're not showing up, is that there was a mutation. So if you have, if there's enough mutations that happen, then they won't be a match to you. They won't be shown as a match because they'll be outside of our matching parameters. And so that's what probably happened, is that there was a mutation that happened between you and your mother, and that puts you outside of the genetic distance possibly. But I would actually review this. If you send me that, I'll review your test and I'll be able to give a more thorough answer. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Oh yeah, I'll do that, Sherman. I'll send you an email with the kit numbers and such.
Suzanne,
yeah, but that's typically what's happening, though.
Suzanne, this is Marlene. I tested my Emt Dna 15 years ago, and I have no real matches. I've had a couple of people get close, but not close enough to be within the last 10,000 years.
Yeah, that happens. I'm the same way as well. And that's why we're trying to start a new project called the Million Mito Project, where we're trying to encourage citizen scientists like you and everyone else to actually get more involved, because mtDNA testing has actually been neglected over the last few years because of the advances in Ydna and autosomal DNA testing. So right now, like, our company is trying to make a concerted effort to encourage people to do more mtDNA testing, so we'll actually be able to make more connections, because it's probably been neglected by testers and companies, and so we're trying to change that in hopes to encourage more people to test, so we'll be able to figure out our surnames and get better matches and things of that nature. So they started a project called the Million Mito Project. I think Roberta Estes, she's another genealogist. She's a contractor with our company. She and some other researchers at our company started this project to encourage more people to get into mtDNA testing, because it's kind of lagging behind Ydna testing. The Y haplotry is just so thoroughly defined, and there's many more gaps with our mtDNA tree. So we need to fill in those gaps. That's something that we're actually working on.
That sounds like a really worthwhile project.
Yes, ma'am. It's been neglected. Definitely, we understand that, and that's why, as she was saying just briefly ago, she's tested 15 years ago, and she doesn't have any relevant matches in yet. So, yeah, ultimately, we're trying to change that, and so we'll be able to get better matches in for people.
Now, on surname projects, I do believe on the Y testing, I don't know if they're still doing it, but I know that you could, if you had a kit, you could donate more money towards other people taking the test if they can't afford to do it. Do they still do that?
Yes, ma'am. We have a donate button, and people do that all the time. They'll donate money to the project. And so you typically go to the project page. You can probably go to like a public page, and you can hit the donate button. And so, yeah, that's done pretty frequently. And so that's what I work with a lot in my department, with the donations, whether it's it could be other people in the project that they want to pay a portion on this other tester's upgrade or whatnot. So it's really a community effort. So yeah, we still allow that, because that really allows more people to enter the database who can't afford it, just to have people that kind of all pitching in to get them upgraded to see what their genetic information will reveal.
Wonderful. Okay. Oh, hold on. There's some people in the chat box here. Let me just double check here. Let's see here. Hold on. Tracy says that she's uploaded her DNA to FamilyTree DNA from her Ancestry DNA test. Would I get different information if I took an autosomal test from FamilyTree DNA?
Yes, possible you'll get more matches back, because they were it depends on when you tested with Ancestry, because they did switch up to a different chip. So at one point in time, they were functioning on a different chip than us, or their chip had less data. And so testers from Ancestry will upload into our database and just get a few matches. They may get a couple hundred matches. And then, our developers went into the raw data file, and they just saw that it's looks like they might have took out some information from the raw data file to kind of prevent this from them uploading to other databases. So it just really depends on the chip that you're on with Ancestry. So I definitely would recommend, of course, you upload your test. If you don't, you should have a good amount of matches, but if you don't, you're typically by purchasing a family finder, because that's what we were having people to do once we realized that those transfers, this was a couple of years ago, that those transfers in Ancestry wasn't, customers weren't getting all their matches. Like they were missing good matches, like people who were first, second cousins weren't showing up, and they had tested with FamilyTree DNA, etc. And so, yeah, that's when we started encouraging customers to actually purchase the family finder, because I think our chip at the time was like, it was more data, so they were able to get all their matches, as opposed to just a few. And so noticeable matches were being left out at the time, but I think their chip is now compatible, and so I think transferring into our database at this point in time should get you your correct amount of matches. But if you recognize that, a certain match isn't showing up, then yeah, you may want to consider testing, having the family finder done, just so you'll be able to get all your matches. So it's really kind of hit or miss when you test it with Ancestry.
Yeah, and Ancestry doesn't do Y or Mt Dna; they just do autosomal. So you won't get any Y or Mt Dna matches if you upload your Ancestry stuff. I've done both. I uploaded my Ancestry to FamilyTree DNA, and then I also did full testing to get the Y and Mt Dna, and I did not see any significant difference between my matches, autosomal matches.
Mm-hmm. And that's why we encourage customers. I mean, I guess that's why they allowed them that option is, okay, you can transfer over for free, and then you'll be able to order your Y and Mt Dna testing if you like. But some people will go ahead and purchase a family finder.
Wonderful. Okay, any other questions? We got some good thinkers here in the class, so any other questions?
Yeah, definitely.
No? Give it just a few more seconds. This is your chance. All the times you ask about DNA, this is the time to ask the questions.
And of course, if you have any other questions in the meantime before my next one, definitely you can forward them to me, and I'll try to get them answered, and we can discuss them next week as well.
Okay, wonderful. Okay.
Well, I do have a DNA thing. I can't remember what grandparents it was. I'm recollecting it was some third or fourth grandparents that I descended from both of them. They were married to different people. I descended from both of them, and then their spouses died, and then they married each other.
Okay.
And then they had children.
So,
well, they were not related.
Okay, I got you.
I was a descendant of both of them and their spouses.
Okay.
But when their spouses died, I guess through family they knew each other, and they were, not directly related, so they married, and then they also had children from that. So it very much confused my family tree trying to figure out, how I was related to someone or a cousin that way. Which spouse was the proper spouse.
That's correct.
So you get things like that happen. It's double cousins, things like that.
Yeah, I'll be talking about that next week. Some of those situations. I'll give some examples of, where people are related to you multiple ways, and I kind of use a chromosome browser or what is it called, genome painting, to kind of triangulate back to the common ancestor. And so, yeah, that happens pretty frequently, especially, because at a certain point in time, people, they lived in these communities and they didn't have cars, and so they weren't really able to get outside their community and meet other people like that. And so I have a lot of instances like that within my family. I mean, I even have some like first cousins that married each other. And so it's all pretty interesting once we're looking at their DNA and from the descendants, from their kids, etc. And so it's pretty interesting when you stumble on stuff like that.
Yeah, you had mentioned about marrying sisters. I have my Civil War ancestor married sisters, and he had children with both of them.
So they were 3/4 siblings. That's what they call it.
I've had that happen.
And it looks like with DNA, it looks like they might be half siblings sometimes, but once you look at it on a chromosome browser and you look at the blocks of shared DNA, you'll be like, okay, well, this is an interesting case. There must be, 3/4 siblings. So it's not always apparent, but once you do some further examination using an advanced DNA tool, that's when you could really figure it out 100%. But yeah, that definitely happens quite often. I speak with somebody at least once a month where, a case like that might have happened.
Sherman, I want to say thank you once again for your generosity and your time and your resources today. And we're all looking forward to your next presentation next week.